Good morning, you're watching Businessworld Live. I'm Danie Laurel. It's the start of a new trading day. Let's kick off with our banner story. The Bangko Sentral will ask Malacanang to certify as urgent the proposed amendments to the Bank Secrecy Law. Now, in pushing for the changes, BSP Governor Ben Diokno said in an online briefing that the Philippines is the only country in the world with tight restrictions on bank deposit information. Diokno said the proposed reforms will place the country's deposit secrecy law at par with international standards and will also strengthen the public trust in the banking system. House Bill 8991 was approved by the House Committee on Banks in February. This bill expands the supervisory powers of the central bank by allowing it to look into the deposit accounts of bank stockholders, owners, directors, officers, or employees for investigation purposes on closed banks, given that there are reasonable grounds for fraud, illegal activity, or serious irregularities. With the strengthened capacity of the Bangko Sentral, Diokno said the reforms will benefit depositors by giving them the protection from losses due to fraud or unlawful activities. The amendments also include a safe harbor clause. This will shield lenders from civil cases in relation to deposits examined by the BSP. The Senate version of the bill is still pending at the committee level, but it has not been identified as one of the priority bills pushed by Legislative Executive Department Advisory Council, or the LEDAC. The International Monetary Fund has earlier warned the Philippines that it could again be included in the so-called gray list of the Watchdog Financial Action Task Force if it fails to implement bank secrecy law amendments. Being part of that list could result in delayed processing of transactions, which is seen to affect remittances and business flows. Okay, guys, zooming in on the banks after that bank secrecy law update. You can see on my terminal here, financials opening on the back foot. That's down by 0.2%. Union Bank, however, in the green, up by 1.5%. Now, this also comes as the Bangko Sentral says that they will initially be granting 5 digital banking licenses, although Governor Ben Diokno has now said they might be willing to grant more. So their policy will be the top 5 that they've chosen will get the licenses first, and then they will expand to others if there is still great demand. So far, the license for digital banking has been granted to the Overseas Filipino Bank, and BSP Deputy Gov Chuchi Fonachera had already mentioned last week that they have received 3 other formal applications for the digital banking license. Now, let's take a step back and check in on our open. Unfortunately, still at 64.50, so not back to 6,500 levels, but still a bump up from yesterday's close. It's up by 0.17%. Now, recall that yesterday, SM Prime had dragged down the bourse, and this according to AAA's Chris Mangon. The increased selling pressure on blue chips like SM Prime might be a sign of frustration from investors due to, of course, the lack of concrete positive developments on the health crisis. Although Philstock said that the same sentiment, the negative sentiment that we felt yesterday, was felt all across the region. She said, this from Claire Alviar, that in Asia, some parts of Japan were put on lockdown due to the new wave of COVID-19, and India had set new records for cases and deaths. Now, some stocks to watch here. Let's take a quick peek at San Miguel, opening flattish this morning at 116 pesos and 60 centavos. This as they have announced that they are spending $1 billion. That's for 31 energy storage facilities for batteries with a combined capacity of over 1,000 megawatts. Now, some of SMC Global Power's energy storage facilities are now already in advanced stages of completion, according to their president, Ramon Ang. They have already completed the first storage facility in Zambales. That was in 2018. And finally, on travel, just a quick peek on PAL here. They will be trialing IATA travel passes on their flights to LA and Singapore starting on May. So that is joining 27 participating airlines globally. That's from 25 different countries. They will be doing a test drive, so from May to June, on such flights. Now, what is the Travel Mobile Pass application? That is developed by the International Air Transport Association, or IATA, and they allow passengers to digitally manage the travel documents and also share the COVID test results. So they enable them to upload partner and accredited COVID testing centers. So one of which, according to PAL, will be the Toxicare Molecular Diagnostics Lab. So they can actually upload those test results and then you can have it in an app. Now, this according to Tourism Secretary Berna Puyat. Romulo Puyata, once the country's adoption of this IATA travel pass is put into motion, then the Department of Tourism might open the tourist destinations to international visitors when the time is right. So exciting times there. But for now, the Philippines is actually asking its workers abroad to delay the return to the nation if they don't have essential travel necessities. Here, OWA says that the budget for returning migrant workers isolation facilities will be used up by next month already, and the government is finding ways to address that fund shortage. Let's check in on the biggest headlines this Thursday morning. Business name registrations in the first quarter reached nearly half of the full year figure reported last year. Trade Secretary Mon Lopez said the number of registrations in the first 3 months hit close to 433,000. That's almost half of last year's 916,000 registrations. Lopez attributed this to the prolonged impact of the pandemic. He said people are adapting to these challenging times through innovation and entrepreneurship. Still, small businesses continue to be affected by the pandemic. Lopez earlier said the number of small businesses applying for loans remained lower than expected, marking a sustained weakness in business confidence. And this from the Philippine Star, the Asian Development Bank says the Philippine economy remains fragile. That's amid the limited boost in consumer and business confidence as COVID-19 cases continue to increase. ADB Country Director Kelly Bird said there remains a huge uncertainty in the economy, especially with infections continuing to surge. Bird adds that the community quarantine will also delay the recovery as unemployment remains high, with several sectors yet to fully reopen. He also said private investment would likely remain stagnant for the rest of the year because of a lot of excess capacity. On the upside, exports recovery and infrastructure spending would be the saving grace of the economy. Still, Bird emphasized that the vaccine rollout remains key to the safe reopening of the economy and boosting consumer and business confidence. Now, for its part, the Finance Department assures that vaccinations would ramp up over the second half of the year. That's as the government secures more vaccine supply. Now, in their latest report, Moody says that the Philippines will be a laggard in Asia Pacific when it comes to recovery and growth. Is there still a solution here? To chat with us, we have Chief Economist for Asia Pacific and the author of that latest report, Stephen Cochrane. Good morning, Stephen, and welcome to the broadcast.
Good morning.
Stephen, let's kick off with a quick overview. Can you give us a general feel of your latest findings, where the world is at, the key highlights of your latest report? This is, of course, dated April 18th.
So the world is actually coming into a pretty good place. You know, the global economy has been in a recovery period for some time, largely because of demand for goods around the world, and that's been a very strong factor for the Asia Pacific economy because so many of the goods that are consumed around the world are produced in this part of the world. And then this year, the driving factors are pivoting a bit. The U.S. economy will be an important support for global growth because of its very, very strong fiscal stimulus spending that's in place right now and likely will continue for some time. So there'll be good multiplier effects for Asia Pacific and from the U.S. and then ultimately June, July, August, sometime in the summer months when the vaccines are rolled out in Europe and the European economies open up a bit more as well. It should be very good. The performance across Asia Pacific, of course, will be somewhat varied, partly because of the differential pace of the rollout of vaccines, which will help some countries to open up earlier and others it'll be slower. The fastest rollout of vaccines has been in Singapore, much faster than any place else. It gives some comparative advantage to Singapore in terms of potentially the ability to open up travel and tourism here in Singapore the second half of the year. And then, of course, other countries where they're still struggling to control COVID, a very basic problem. And of course, the Philippines is one. Indonesia has been there. Thailand has new spikes. You mentioned the emergency orders in Japan, all working to add some friction to opening up of the domestic economy, the service-based economies, and get the recovery going full speed. So broadly, the outlook is good, but then across the region, there are differences.
Stephen, is Moody's predicting, of course, we don't know whether there will still be more waves in terms of infections, but what about the so-called double dip recession globally? Is that still going to happen, or now with the vaccine rollouts, that's the worst is behind us?
I think the combination of the vaccine rollouts and the very strong fiscal response in the U.S., I think these are two factors that will keep the global economy from dipping, attempting a double dip recession. That's not to say that some countries might not face that. And if you look at the prospects for India, for example, a very large economy and now struggling with its second wave of COVID, it's a real disappointment, actually. Fourth quarter last year was very strong for India, and then all of a sudden they're struggling once again with COVID. So there are some countries where that's a potential, but not globally.
Okay. Stephen, you mentioned that the outlook for Asia Pacific is improving, but is not evenly distributed. To what extent is this due to the vaccine rollout, as you were mentioning, and to what extent is it due to fiscal policy? Can we say that our country that has not been as aggressive, so to speak, in terms of fiscal aid, will catch up, assuming that the vaccine rollout comes into play?
Yeah. The role of fiscal policy is really to add some stability to the economy until the vaccines get rolled out and until the broader local domestic service producing side of the economy is truly back and active the way it was before COVID. So that's a stabilizing factor that's important, and there's very strong fiscal spending in places like Singapore and Malaysia and Japan. It has been limited in the Philippines, and I think given the current wave of COVID, I would think that there's still a role for fiscal policy to play in supporting SMEs and supporting individuals that have lost their jobs, simply to maintain consumer spending through this rough period in the economy. But then the vaccines, of course, play a really important role. For two reasons. One, of course, a basic public health of just getting through COVID and minimizing the disruptions from the quarantines. The other, even for countries that aren't struggling to control COVID, I think broad vaccination of the population is going to be very important in order to create the ability to open up the economy to travel, to both business travel and leisure travel. If there's a lot of COVID in a country, people are going to hesitate to come visit, particularly as the number of variants grow and there's some uncertainty about how effective the vaccines will be against some of these variants. So the quicker that the vaccinations can be rolled out and the new caseload of COVID is minimized, the better for every country across the region, of course.
Okay, so even more need for the Philippines to accelerate that vaccine rollout without this fiscal response. Stephen, let's focus on the Philippines here. Just for our viewers to understand, I mean, there's a vaccine shortage globally. That's an issue even in Europe and the most developed countries. But you mentioned that this is the issue here, and this is what's going to make our country a laggard. Tell us now that the government has been rolling it out. We just reported that Sec Dominguez has assured that the second quarter and even the second half of the year will really bring in all the vaccines that we need here to get herd immunity. What is the bottleneck of our vaccine rollout? Is it the fault of our structural issues? Is it something that the rest of the countries are struggling with? And do you feel that this is slowly being addressed?
Well, many countries in Asia were actually a little slow in procuring vaccines, and the Philippines was no exception. But I always assumed that would happen, and indeed it is happening with the help of the Asian Development Bank and the COVAX program and such. There are vaccines now available, as you said, in the Philippines. The difficulty, though, every country in the world has faced logistical difficulties in terms of rolling it out across base. If you look at Asia Pacific, where has the rollout been the fastest? It's been in the very small territories in Singapore and Hong Kong, where there are indeed logistical difficulties as well, but nothing compared to a country like the Philippines with all of its many islands and the difficulty in transporting and storing a vaccine. And every country, even, we know in the US and in Europe, they had difficulties in the beginning in terms of just setting up the logistics of doing this as quickly. No one's ever really rolled out a vaccination program as quickly and as urgently as this one is. And every country is unique, and every country has to find a way to work with its own public health system, its own geographic shape, and so forth. And of course, that's what the Philippines, like every other country, has to figure this out, working with the public health system, working with the private sector, and then working with the transportation bottlenecks that the country faces.
Okay, and Stephen, last question before we let you go. You mentioned that a lot hinges upon the global recovery as well. To what extent will the BPO sector be a bright spot here, particularly also the remittances? We still have seen some positive growth in that space. To what extent will those things offset the issues that we have about travel and still particularly being a laggard and being able to open up our economy to tourism?
You make a good point. Remittances, of course, are really important. They can account for up to 10% of GDP in the Philippines. There was a bit of a pause early on when COVID first hit in terms of remittances and when most of the global economy was shut down. This was back, of course, in the third quarter of last year. Those remittances have picked up, though, and as other economies where there are many overseas Filipino workers in the U.S. and in the Middle East, I think those are two good examples. And workers are back to work and earning and feeling comfortable in those parts of the world. We'll continue to see remittances, and that fits into the historical pattern in that other times during periods of economic weakness, the pace of remittances actually accelerated as overseas Filipino workers were helping out their families here.
Okay, so some bright spots still there, hoping for that to be sustained in terms of the accelerated pace in remittance flows. Thank you so much for those insights, Stephen Cochrane, Moody's.
Thank you.
That's a first look into the business day. Today's Thursday, April 22nd, 2021. Catch Businessworld live for the market close at 3:15 p.m. today. I'm Danie Laurel. Mask on, wash hands, stay safe, Philippines. We are One News.